Our next panel, I want to invite them to turn on their cameras. This one has been years in the making. If these four and our moderator have spoken together on the same panel, it's news to me. But in the spirit of it's better to talk to each other than to talk, better to talk to each other than to talk about each other, we are delighted to bring together Scott Lincecum, Vice President of General Economics at the Stifel Trade Policy Center at the Cato Institute and the head of the new Defending Globalization Project, if I've got the phrase right. Scott, my old friend Bill Reinsch, a senior advisor and the Skoll Chair in International Business at CSIS, a former president of the National Foreign Trade Council, and someone who played a key role in the 1988 Trade Act that Susan talked about. Stephen Vaughn, partner at the International Trade Team at King and Spalding, and a former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And Lori Wallach, I know she's on here, and she's going to hopefully turn on her camera. Lori is the director of the Rethink Trade and Economic Liberties Project and a senior advisor at the Citizens Trade Campaign. Here comes Lori. And our moderator, my dear friend and my longtime friend, Brian Pomper, a partner at Aiken Gump, or I guess just Aiken these days, a former chief trade counsel at the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, and something that folks may not know about Brian because it wasn't in the bios, but he's also a partial owner of Smoke Barbecue on the north side of Chicago. A lot of interesting folks here and a really great discussion we're looking forward to having. Brian, take it away.
Outstanding. Thanks so much, Ken. And I have to say, it's daunting to have to follow the last panel and Ted's excellent moderating. Let me just start by thanking you, Ken, and Diego, and all the folks at WITA who do such a good job of bringing us to the trade community together. Whatever side of these debates you land on, WITA is always a great forum, and you really do create a great trade community. And a shout out to all my friends out there. I saw the attendance list on this, so I hope you all have an excellent holiday season, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the new year. So boy, I'm tempted just to kind of let you guys go. And hey, what do you think of the last panel? Because boy, there was a lot discussed in the last panel, but let me maybe pick it up sort of where Ted left it off when he was talking about China and maybe the fact that we're dealing with China, we were previously talking with allies. How much has China changed the trade calculus here in the last 20 years? Is that why we are where we are on trade policy? And maybe Lori, let me start with you.
You know, I want to take a step back even further, having listened to the first panel, which was extremely interesting, and say one of the things I noted, which I think may be part of why there's a lot of talking across, and I really appreciate this panel bringing this set of broad, different views together, is because the last panel conflated the theory of free trade, and if you will, tariff theory, the economics of it, with U.S. trade agreements. And Ambassador Johnson mentioned, like, what is neoliberalism? And that is, to some, the agenda of all the non-tariff stuff that ended up in the NAFTA, in the WTO, with respect to investor rights, extending.
On their cameras. This one has been years in
but I'll just mention that those are tough issues. I also voted for assault weapon ban and Medicaid funding of abortion. But you know, I guess that makes me an old liberal and not just a neo one, which I'm fighting right now, the neoliberals.
Thank you very much, Sean. We've got 1 minute left, which means I'm gonna take the last word here. And I wonder whether, you know, in this discussion, there's not some sort of forward-looking compromise, which is, you know, if you go back to the pre-WTO era, the pre-China era, we were essentially negotiating trade liberalization agreements with friends and allies. And that maybe, you know, trying to square, you know, best concern about worker rights and the quality of these agreements and, you know, the broader concerns about China, maybe that's where we end up. I mean, that was the old GATT system at the end of the day. And I think that would involve, for instance, in a second Biden term, finding some way back into the CPTPP. I mean, those are friendly countries, allied countries that we want to be part of our broader supply chain security coalition. So I don't know if that's where we end up, but it seems to me it's the only kind of formula that in some way squares all the different things we're talking about in the panel. And because we're out of time, nobody can rebut me here. So I'm going to throw it back to Ken. Thank you all for a great discussion, and we'll turn it over to the next panel.
Oh my gosh, I could have done this. I could have had you guys on for another hour. There's so much to talk about. You guys, it was a masterclass, and we are incredibly grateful. There were several other questions that were in the chat. Ted, we wove a few of them in. We didn't get to all of them. I'm sorry about that, but our panelists know about the questions. They see them, and we will share them with them so that they can see those questions that were asked that we didn't get to. But we are going to move on to our next panel. Thank you, Ted, Wendy, Susan, Beth, and Don. Really grateful to you so much. Our next panel, I want to invite them to turn on their cameras. This one has been years in the making. If these four and our moderator have spoken together on the same panel, it's news to me. But in the spirit of it's better to talk to each other than to talk, better to talk to each other than to talk about each other, we are delighted to bring together Scott Lincecum, Vice President of General Economics at the Stifel Trade Policy Center at the Cato Institute, and the head of the new Defending Globalization Project, if I've got the phrase right. Scott, my old friend Bill Reinsch, a senior advisor and the Skoll Chair in International Business at CSIS, a former president of the National Foreign Trade Council, and someone who played a key role in the 1988 Trade Act that Susan talked about. Stephen Vaughn, partner at the International Trade Team at King & Spalding, and a former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And Lori Wallach, I know she's on here, and she's going to hopefully turn on her camera. Lori is the director of the Rethink Trade and Economic Liberties Project and a senior advisor at the Citizens Trade Campaign. Here comes Lori. And our moderator, my dear friend and my longtime friend, Brian Pomper, a partner at Aiken Gump, or I guess just Aiken these days, a former chief trade counsel at the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, and something that folks may not know about Brian because it wasn't in the bios, but he's also a partial owner of Smoke Barbecue on the north side of Chicago. A lot of interesting folks here, and a really great discussion we're looking forward to having. Brian, take it away.
Outstanding. Thanks so much, Ken. And I have to say, it's daunting to have to follow the last panel and Ted's excellent moderating. Let me just start by thanking you, Ken, and Diego, and all the folks at WITA who do such a good job of bringing us to the trade community together. Whatever side of these debates you land on, WITA is always a great forum, and you really do create a great trade community. And a shout out to all my friends out there. I saw the attendance list on this, so I hope you all have an excellent holiday season, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the new year. So boy, I'm tempted just to kind of let you guys go. And hey, what do you think of the last panel? Because boy, there was a lot discussed in the last panel, but let me maybe pick it up sort of where Ted left it off when he was talking about China and maybe the fact that we're dealing with China, we were previously talking with allies. How much has China changed the trade calculus here in the last 20 years? Is that why we are where we are on trade policy? And maybe Lori, let me start with you.
You know, I want to take a step back even further, having listened to the first panel, which was extremely interesting, and say one of the things I noted, which I think may be part of why there's a lot of talking across, and I really appreciate this panel bringing this set of broad, different views together, is because the last panel conflated the theory of free trade, and if you will, tariff theory, the economics of it, with U.S. trade agreements. And Ambassador Johnson mentioned, like, what is neoliberalism? And that is, to some, the agenda of all the non-tariff stuff that ended up in the NAFTA, in the WTO, with respect to investor rights, extending monopoly patents and other intellectual property rules and trade agreements, service sector liberalization and deregulation, regulatory harmonization or capping or setting rules on standards. And I have to say, I agree with Wendy. Part of what transformed the US trade debate was when trade agreements got into all this other business and stopped being about tariffs. Now, we can have a debate about tariff theory, And, Professor Samuelson wrote that stunning paper around 2000, where he did the math and basically showed that in the US, as macroeconomic theory predicts, when you liberalize, and this is the straight up trade theory, tariff stuff, you end up bringing down wages in rich countries, and you bring down wages more than you bring down the prices of goods. So it actually can be a net loss in rich countries. And that's a projection of macroeconomic theory. Putting that aside, if you look at all the other stuff that's in the trade agreements, I think that's probably the biggest transformational change. And sometimes, I was tickled by the theory of 250 years of Boston Tea Party. But honestly, a lot of people who I hang around with think of the Seattle WTO protests as the 225th anniversary, a quarter millennium anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, because that was the moment, like the Boston Tea Party, where a lot of people had become savvy that something that was trade, and that was branded that, and arguably some of that stuff shouldn't have been in trade agreements, and that's sort of part of the problem, but that became very personal. People realized it was impacting them in a very concrete way. And the people who were on the streets were people who were upset about what had happened to environmental laws, getting sacked under the WTO. They were people who were upset about food safety issues because we no longer had the equal to US standards import limits. All of people who were access to medicines, HIV/AIDS activists, who saw the TRIPS agreement and the IP rules causing limits on access to affordable medicines. So that moment of people on the streets again, and there really was, the steelworkers had a second Boston Tea Party. I don't know if folks remember that, but they actually chucked stuff into the harbor with strings on it because they were working with the enviros to bring it back out and not pollute. But they did reenact that actual event and basically said, we need rules that work for people. So I will just stop by saying, I think the debate we need to be having is what rules for the global economy. Now, when we get back to the tariffs question, I have what to say about that, because we now have a super low tariff environment. I mean, if you look at the countries we think as, the protectionists, I just pulled up the World Bank data. China applied trade weighted average 3.3. I mean, we're slightly less. We're 2.6. The EU's at 2.8. India is at 7. I mean, if you think of, relative to like pre-Uruguay round, pre all the FTAs, the tariff issue in a way is, while important in some instances and with some peaks, kind of secondary to all the other stuff. And thinking forward about these issues about economic security, the era of climate chaos, and whether we'll be able to have globalized production chains and long distance shipping, or the costs of that shipping will be internalized and the dynamics very different. I think we're just at a pivot point where we need to talk about the rules.
Okay, thanks, Lori, very much. Bill, maybe let me ask you to respond to what Lori said when we've, and I think she picked up on what Wendy said, where when trade policy got beyond tariffs, moved to regulatory matters, that's really what started to garner a lot of the opposition to trade that we see in some quarters today. Was it a mistake for us to do that, or was that beneficial to the American economy?
Well, I think it was inevitable. I mean, I think the irony of what Lori is talking about is that she's actually proposing more rules and more interference or involvement, might be a better word, a more neutral word, in people's lives through the rules that she and the administration are pursuing. If it's just tariffs, it's simple. The reality is that, as starting in the 50s and 60s, tariffs went down pretty much to the levels that Lori just described. They became less relevant. And as with a lot of things in trade, you push the balloon here and it expands over there. So people came up with other devices to not have to deal with the consequences of lower tariffs. And they created their own set of protectionist, mostly standards, regulations, things that got in the way of the trade that lower tariffs were supposed to encourage. And the result was then that negotiators started to tackle other things. They started to tackle phytosanitary standards. They started to tackle regulatory issues. Your way around, they tackled IP protections. They started to tackle more and more things. I think where we've run into a problem is that the things that are on the table now cut much more closely to people's daily lives than do tariffs. I mean, tariffs matter from a price standpoint, but I think you walk into a store to buy a shirt, and you don't immediately think of what's the tariff, what tariff am I paying on this? But when you start talking about how are we going to regulate things that people use every day, how are we going to regulate the internet? How are we going to deal with supply chain shortages with vaccines and things like that? How are we going to make sure that our food is safe? And maybe we make sure our food is safe by not letting in imports. Those issues affect people directly, and they are much more emotional about them. And that's sort of where I think we sort of ended up having to deal with that. I mean, I'm tempted to say, sure, let's go back to tariffs. It would be a lot simpler, and we would probably have a lot more agreements. But I have to say, it's right now the people that are putting more rules on the table are Lori, and the people that agree with her point of view. What I worry about is that we're imposing too great a burden on the trading system. I'm not sure the trading system is designed for or capable of solving every problem that we've got. Climate, fossil fuels, inclusivity, worker rights, human rights are now on the table. These are all good things. I mean, they're good ideas, and they're important values. And I agree with Beth's point that we should stand up for them. I'm not sure the trading system is capable of dealing with all of them as aggressively as some of the proposals would have it too.
Thanks, Bill. Stephen, what do you think? Is the trading system trying to take on too much? What do you think trade policy should be? Here we are in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, I want to sort of pick up on, I thought the first panel did a good job of talking about the history. And I know we'd like to talk about sort of the distinction between Hamilton and Jefferson. But I wanted to start with a quote from Jefferson's report on commerce, which goes as follows: free commerce and navigation are not to be given in exchange for restrictions and vexations, nor are they likely to produce a relaxation of them. And Jefferson was arguing that if another country wants to put up prohibitions, duties, and regulations, we will have to put up counter prohibitions, duties, and regulations as well, because the alternative is just failure. And so I think we act as though, well, we used to have Jefferson and the free traders and people like Cordell Hull who had a reciprocal trade policy. And then we had the protectionists like Hamilton. And our trade debate has been somewhere in between all that. That's not actually true. Starting in the 1990s, we abandoned this concept of reciprocity. We went well beyond Hamilton. We went well beyond Jefferson. We just kind of walked off the board completely. And we came up with this idea that, we'll just outsource a lot of trade policy to Geneva. We will let countries put up barriers against us, and we'll just do nothing in response. And somehow that's all going to work out. And I think that was just a very radical idea. I mean, a really radical idea, like a downright experimental idea that had never been tried in American history, had never really been tried by any significant nation ever, with the possibility of the British Empire in the late 19th century. And the British lost their empire, and it didn't work for us either. So I think now we're trying to kind of get back to what I think of as a more normal trade policy, where we're expecting to sit down with parties who want to do business with us and try to reach agreements that are fair. In terms of are these negotiations going to put too much of a strain on the system and it's all going to break down? No, of course not. We negotiated before 1994. We had over 200 years of trade negotiations. We always had, for the most part, we made some mistakes here and there, but the U.S. economy grew for pretty much the whole 200 years. Last year, we exported $1.7 trillion worth of goods, and we imported $2.6 trillion worth of goods. So I don't think the trading system is falling apart or is under strain or anything like that. And so I think, what we're basically doing, in my opinion, is we're kind of returning to our roots. We're basically putting trade policy where it should be, back in the hands of elected policymakers. We're abandoning an experiment, which maybe given the end of the Cold War and kind of all the hope that was associated with the Cold War, you can understand why people thought that might work, but obviously it didn't work. And now I think we're headed for a more practical and, in my opinion, a much more successful approach.
All right, Scott, I got to have you respond to that, because I could see you're kind of squirming in your chair a little bit.
No, it's fine. I mean, there's a lot that's been discussed. I'll just hit on a few points. First on the trade agreements point, I mean, I think it's essential to understand that, trade agreements, even, we at Cato particularly have noted, are a necessary evil. in the sense that, we're not able to achieve what the economists want, that we have a political system and need trade agreements as part of that, right? And that, the idea that this is, Milton Friedman and Larry Summers in a lab foisting trade agreements on all of us, it's nonsense, right? I mean, the reality is we understand these things as a political necessity to achieve trade objectives. And because of that, of course, they do end up having details, provisions that we dislike as a free trader, as a not a free trader, as a skeptic, whatever. And that's, the legislative sausage making it work. And I think, we can find pretty broad agreement on that reality. However, it's really important, I think, to remember that the actual details of these agreements matter. You look at a lot of the discourse around, and I'm going to put on my trade lawyer days from back at Big Law, which I fortunately abandoned, and you look at the actual terms and you see that these provisions allow for the type of policy space that we're told doesn't exist. GATT Article 20, of course, being the famous example. And you look at the rulings that are involved. And yes, you can disagree on the margins, but the idea that these things don't allow for regulatory experimentation and environmental and the rest, that's just, again, it's belied by the actual text and these rulings. But the other reality is the empirical reality. And, fortunately, we have a lot of economics literature and political science and history since the time Thomas Jefferson made that quote, right? And the reality is that if you look at these studies, if you look at the performance of the U.S. economy, if you look at what actually happens, whether it's the ITC doing these meta studies of U.S. trade agreements or whatever, you see that the reality is, A, it is not the economic panacea it's claimed to be, but it's also not the economic Armageddon it's claimed to be. It's these small but significant improvements in the U.S. economy over longer periods of time. If you look at what median wages have done adjusted for inflation since the hyper-globalization period began, we're up about 40% for median worker wages. If you look at the improvements in U.S. living standards since those halcyon days of the 1960s, they're fantastic. And so, yes, problems exist. Yes, there are issues, but if you look at these kind of broad brush things, this portrait of American carnage, I think, is pretty misguided. But the other thing we have since those good old Jeffersonian days is we've seen a lot of the potential alternatives to what is a freer trade, more open trade environment. Those alternatives, quite frankly, aren't working very well or haven't worked very well. Whether it is the Trump tariffs or IPEF or whatever, these vaunted alternatives are now being put into practice. And quite frankly, they're imposing high costs. They're not achieving their objectives. They're preventing market access. They're discouraging security objectives in the case of something like the TPP. So, I think that that's the benefit we have. We have a 200 years of economic history, political science history, and a lot of empirical literature that can give us better confidence than maybe Thomas Jefferson had back then.
Well, so then let me ask, if the old trade model is dead, right? And Ambassador Tai talks about, these are, 20th century trade agreements. IPEF was this administration's attempt. The trade pillar, at least so far, has failed to gain much traction. What should U.S. trade policy be? And I just read this morning that the administration seems to be setting aside any kind of deal with the UK. So, Stephen, your idea about negotiating with people who want to negotiate with us, I don't know if that will work either. What should U.S. trade policy be?
Well, can I first of all, I just want to, in terms of some of these figures, right? In other words, in 2000, we let China in, we gave China PNTR, right? And that, at that point, that was kind of the apotheosis of the sort of a model that I think a lot of the folks at Cato wanted to have. And that year, in 2000, the real median household income in the United States was $67,470. Now, by 2015, 15 years later, pretty much the heart of your career, if you're a person my age, it was only $68,410. So Scott's right. We do have these numbers. We know what happened. We did this and it failed, right? Now, we then tried different policies, and by 2019, it was up to $78,250, which is better. So I think we know that. I will say I agree with Scott on the fact that trade is not sort of often it's not always the driving thing. You have to look at tax policy and regulatory policy and all these other policies. But I think basically what we have to do, Brian, is we can't just say this is our trade policy and the workers of America have to adjust to that trade policy. We have to say this is the kind of country we want to have. These are the type of living standards we want to have. These are the type of industries we want to have. These are the type of community that we want to live in. And then let's have a trade policy that gets us that. And I think too often we basically said this is our trade policy and all you guys have to adjust to it. And I want to flip that. I want to say, let's have strong jobs in America. Let's have high wage jobs in America. Let's drive up that real median household income so that people are seeing their living standards go up year after year after year. And then let's make sure that our trading policy is consistent with that. So I think that's going to require a lot of flexibility, a lot of change. There was a lot of conversation in the last panel about the 88 Act. There wasn't just an 88 Act. There was an 84 Act. There was a 79 Act. There was a 74 Act. Congress used to make trade policy, and they used to update the trade policy to take into account new developments and new facts. They used to experiment with things like Trade Promotion Authority. They didn't just sort of put everything in a box and say, okay, we can't touch this anymore. It's going to take a lot of experimentation. It's going to take a lot of time. You know, we had basically 30 years of sort of letting this experiment play out, but I think that's over. And I think you're going to start to see, you know, a lot of positive changes going forward.
So in your regard, I'll get to you next, Lori. But just to follow up real quick with Stephen. So is IPEF, in your view, one of these experiments? Is that the idea?
Yeah, of course. I think it. Look, one thing everybody's got to understand, you know, and I know people get frustrated with this. There's very, very little reason at this point for other countries to do a trade deal with the United States, right? When you export, you know, when your trade deficit in goods is $800-900 billion a year, that means other countries pretty much have the access to your market that they want, right? So when you sit down with them and you say, hey, we want you to buy more dairy, or we want you to buy more ag, or we want you, why? Why would they do that? Why would they give you anything? They've got everything they want. So there's really no reason for them to come to the table at all. If you get leverage on them, then yes, as the last administration showed, you can get people to the table and you can get new agreements. But unless you're willing to sort of at least have those conversations, there's not a lot you can do. So, okay. You know, I think that, you know, I think everybody understands, you know, anybody who was sort of here for the debate over TPP in 2016 understands that's an absolute non-starter. It could never get through the Congress. It couldn't get through the Congress back in 2015. It's not going to get through the Congress now. So I thought IPEF was an effort by the new administration to try something in that space. Obviously, my guess is they've been a little disappointed in the willingness of other countries to engage. But unfortunately, right now, other countries, as Jefferson warned, other countries don't have much reason to engage.
Thank you, Stephen. Lori?
So what I was going to say is I was going to challenge Bill. Maybe a way forward, if we have a deal, is if you were to get all of those other chapters out, I would take a deal and shake the hand to get rid of GATS, TRIPS, TRIMS, ISDS, and the FTAs, get rid of SPS, TBT, the Agreement on Procurement. Because then if you go back to the trade part, it's still a question of under what rules, but let's just say you cut all the tariffs. I want to go and do a counterfactual to that, but let's just say you zeroed out tariffs. You'd still need to do things like rules of origin, and you would need to have something like a subsidies discipline mechanism. And this gets to serve that we're not trying to junk up all the agreements with new issues, but rather, if you think about the things that countries do to externalize costs to try and make their product cheaper in your market, then part of the things they do is they bust unions to bring down wages artificially. They dump on the environment. I mean, that concept of all the literature of social dumping, but some of it you can quantify. Hell, some of it probably is actionable under Section 301. You could actually probably show, you could quantify a bunch of that stuff. Now, that's a different thing than some of the other values-related propositions that have been put forward. No one's trying to fix climate on a trade agreement. But the question is where are the market signals you send within the rules you set up of your trade. So that's the sort of actual trade part. And I don't know if Bill wants to take that challenge.
Bill, what do you think? What do you think? You taking Lori's deal?
Well, the cynic the cynic in me says that even if I did that, she'd find a way to oppose it anyway. I don't think you've ever been for any of these things. Um, we can give it a try and see what happens. I don't think the idea of getting rid of things that are already there, we've already agreed to, is realistic at all. But going forward, if you want to try to simplify, if you want to drop all of your demands, I'll be happy to drop all of mine, and we can focus just on tariffs. I think that's not entirely irrelevant. One of the things that we've written a number of papers on IPEF, which is kind of an interesting example. And one of the things that annoyed me is the administration kept saying, that we're not going to do tariffs because the average U.S. tariff rate is what, 2.6%. I think that's what Lori said it was. So who cares? Well, that's the average. There are peaks, and there are very high peaks, particularly in textiles and apparel. We should have Don Johnson still on this panel. And they tend to be high peaks in areas where our negotiating partners are competitive. So tariffs matter. And I had meetings with people in some of the IPEF or related countries, meaning Taiwan in this case, where it was very clear from the standpoint of the other parties that they were very interested in the United States reducing their tariffs on their items because they thought it was a barrier. Now, I take Stephen's point that it may or may not be in our interest to do that. But to suggest that it's, I think Lori didn't suggest they're irrelevant. I think Beth suggested they're irrelevant. To suggest that they're irrelevant, I think is simply wrong. There's a number of areas where they still matter, and we ought to be taking a look at that. I think the other thing to keep in mind with these things is that, and this goes, I think, more to Stephen's point, I think it's what we discovered in IPEF is that, you can say what you want about their existing access to our market, but they very clearly want more access to our market, and they don't think that what they've got is sufficient. I mean, you can debate whether they're right about that, but there were a lot of things that they wanted to have on the table that we were not putting on the table. So it seems to me that if you wanted to negotiate market access with those countries, there was a negotiation to be had. Now, it would involve, because these things end up being reciprocal on some level, it would result in us making some concessions because we're not going to get anything from them unless we make some. And that's why Lori then would oppose whatever it is we end up with. But, I think the opportunity to do that was there, and we've missed the opportunity. If you talk to the IPEF parties, and you talk to the APEP parties for that matter, or you talk to the UK for that matter, we tend to talk to all of them. They're kind of polite about it, particularly in Asia, but they say, well, we're looking for tangible benefits. Okay, fine with me. We're looking for tangible benefits too, but tangible benefits to them may be something a little bit more to mean something different to them than it does to us. If you ask our administration what they're looking for, is that we're looking for improved worker rights. They're looking for sustainability. They're looking for inclusivity. Well, if you talk to the negotiating partners, they'll say, well, worker rights is a good idea, but that's politically complicated for us because of the nature of our economy. There are a lot of iron rice bowls there that have to be taken on. Decarbonization is really important. We believe in that, but it's expensive and we don't have any money. What are you, the United States, offering to give us an incentive to do what you want us to do? And the US answer is, well, these are good ideas. You should do them because they're good ideas. And I think what we're discovering across the board is that's not good enough for the other countries. And, we may be in the vanguard of a new way of thinking about trade, but the people we're negotiating with are stuck in the past. They look at trade much more traditionally than we do, which is why I kind of being, I think, by far the oldest person on this panel, including the last panel, end up being kind of a traditionalist about these things. It wouldn't bother me if we try to have a regular trade negotiation in which there's some give and take, and we actually end up getting some tangible benefits ourselves in return for giving some tangible benefits.
All right, Bill. Well, thank you.
Can I just hop to your question about IPEF though?
Please.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm a little bit playing with Bill, but because I know it's not realistic to go back, but I'm just making that hypothetical. But going forward, what USTR has tried to do is actually exactly a smart experiment. in another way of going about it. And, you know, whatever happens with IPAF, I wouldn't say necessarily that's the patch of countries I would have picked to try and have an experiment that's focused on what are the rules of the global economy, given there aren't a lot of tariffs to cut. What are the rules that you want to set to meet certain goals, to make sure it works better for working people? Because I can contest Scott's data. We don't have time to go through it, but you know, it has not been a greatly winning outcome, or we wouldn't have the grassroots cross-country rebellion against the status quo that has shifted the politics.
Yeah, let me interrupt you. I don't think there's a grassroots rebellion. I think you're making it up. If you
All
look
right,
at poll
well,
data,
yeah,
after poll
agreed.
data after poll
Patterns,
data, there is
the
support for
voting
trade and there's
patterns,
support for trade
the-
agreements.
Okay,
The
okay.
voting-
Let me turn to Scott here in a second. But first, I want to invoke an old friend and a friend to WITA and to many of us on the panel, Grant Aldonis, former undersecretary, former chief trade counsel at Senate Finance Committee for former great Senator Bill Roth, who used to say, you know, trade negotiations are like, you know, the United States holding a gun to its head saying, boy, agree to this or I'm going to pull the trigger, right? So, Scott, what do you think about that? That it was in terms of lowering tariffs, right?
Yeah.
The idea is saying like it's good for us to lower tariffs. And what I'm really getting at is Stephen's point about how we don't have anything to bargain anymore because we've got low tariffs.
Yeah, well, I think Bill already hit on the fact that, you know, we have a lot of tariff peaks in a lot of areas that developing countries specialize in, right? So I think that's a bit untrue. That said, you know, a lot of time when I have these trade discussions in Washington, a lot of times I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, right? To quote Zoolander, because it's all about manufacturing, even though we're a services economy with leading services firms in the digital space, in the financial space, and the rest. And we're all talking about steel tariffs. Now, look, I know steel tariffs are important, but the fact is that, you know, about 10% of the workforce works in manufacturing. It's a decline that's been happening since the 1940s. It's a decline that's happening in every industrialized nation on the planet, basically. It's a decline that's happening in China now for a lot of seismic reasons, some of which are trade related, a lot of which aren't. If you're worried about male blue collar jobs in the United States, well, there are 4 times as many of those in services as there are in manufacturing. So the idea that our entire U.S. trade policy should be hijacked by a discussion of goods tariffs strikes me as a bit insane. Right. And I think it's essential that when we talk about U.S. trade objectives, that we broaden it out beyond goods tariffs. And I don't mean agricultural exports either, by the way. I mean, sure, those are important, but there are all these essential areas that we totally ignore. And I think it's critical that we at least mention them when we talk about modern trade policy. But let me say one other thing as well, to piggyback off what Bill was saying. Look, if you listen to these countries, not just behind closed doors, but their ambassadors speaking quite publicly, goods market access still matters. I know I just said, you know, manufacturing isn't everything, but for these developing economies, of course, it's more important than it is for the United States. And the certainty of access to the U.S. market is important, right? And that is what trade agreements provide. And one of the reasons why I think devolving the U.S. Trade policy-making process back to the Congress, look, it is great for trade attorneys. It is great for lobbyists. It is great for people who spend every day thinking about how they can get special deals for their clients and their constituents and so forth. It is not, however, so great for having a freer, more open, more consistent and predictable trading environment. That whether that's good for consumers, whether that's good for consuming manufacturers in the United States, exporters, and of course, developing countries as well. And so that type of certainty is really a big part of the deal as well, not merely the actual tariff rates or deals involved. And then last, I'd be remiss not to mention, look, as part of our project, one of the things we're doing here, this globalization project at Cato, is trying to provide a repository of information. And one of the essays that we just published is on this perceived race to the bottom in labor and environmental standards and the rest. And the fact is that if you look at the data, as countries get richer, they tend to have better labor standards. They tend to have better environmental conditions. They tend to have lower per capita CO2 emissions and the rest. And U.S. trade agreements can help them get richer. right? It's not going to be, again, this panacea, but it can help. And so it's a bit frustrating at times for the United States to be out there lecturing developing countries about how they need to have rich country standards, while at the same time denying them the opportunity to get rich like we are. And that, I think, is a really big problem with this current no market access discussion that's going on in the US government.
All right, Scott. Stephen, you
Yeah,
clearly.
yeah, let me just say one thing. I mean, I think Scott and I have certainly found a place of agreement, because I absolutely agree that our trade deals have helped other countries get richer. But Scott, let me ask you this. Can you describe some, I've read a lot of the papers from Cato about the importance of service. What are some blue collar American service jobs that we're going to grow exports of? What would that look like?
Why do you need to grow exports of,
why do
you need to grow exports of
you were saying we should put
services jobs.
Wait a second. You were saying we should put services
right
as a priority in our trade negotiations. Is that right?
No, I'm saying that the United States has substantial comparative advantages in services. So, right. So if you want to increase economic growth, if you want to make the country richer.
Give some examples of what that would look like. How would we grow our trade and services?
I don't. You mean for just in generally?
Let's assume we do what you say. We say, we don't care about goods anymore. We're going to grow we're going to grow services. We're going to have more services jobs. What would that look like in a trade negotiation? How do we grow services jobs through a trade negotiation? What jobs are we going to grow?
I'm confused. Well, first of all, trade doesn't increase jobs. It just leads to different jobs.
What does it mean to put services first in
I'm just very confused. I mean, of course, you just...
the most obvious one, Steve, is tourism.
So we're going to encourage more tourism through trade negotiations?
But the tourism services that we provide count as an export.
I mean, Bill, first of all, you should know I'm actually on your side on this, because I agree with you.
I'm just answering the question. I'm not giving
no. I think other countries are really focused on the trade in goods. Like Bill, I agree with Bill. I think when you sit down with people look at the traditional trade in goods numbers. That's what they're focused on. Now, with Taiwan, for example, in 2022, we exported $44 billion worth of goods to Taiwan, and we imported $91 billion worth of goods from Taiwan. So if you're the Taiwanese, there's no question they would like to have more access to this market, but there's also no question they're happier with the status quo than we are.
But,
so if the
but see, wait, let's take that example. That's
status quo. They're like, okay, well, we'll live with that.
I think that's a perfect example. Let's use Taiwan. The idea that those semiconductors the Taiwanese are sending to the United States aren't benefiting American manufacturers, American service workers at those firms and at other firms. It's loopy, right?
But
the
Scott,
idea that just because there's a trade deficit,
let's Scott finish. Let's Scott
manufacturing loss is silly.
No, listen, I think if to the extent people are happy with the status quo, I think Scott is generally of all of us on the panel, I think Scott's the one happiest with the status quo. If you're happy with the status quo, then you're right. We don't need to get leverage on Taiwan. Look, we don't need to get Taiwan to change its policies. We don't need to get Taiwan to do anything.
Okay, let me
just to get them to change.
Just to say for the record, I'm in no way happy with the status quo, just so we're clear.
Okay, let me bring Lori in. Lori, what's your reaction to this food fight?
So I think the fact that we have such an enormous trade deficit does actually both show a lot of other countries are happy with the status quo, and also, though, is sort of the key to our leverage, which is and this is going to be super controversial and unpopular, but this debate that's starting to happen on China PNTR is sort of, I think, and whether it should be revoked is sort of symbolic of a broader step back discussion, which is if we're going to have a trade policy that is oriented towards certain outcomes, we've tried, as Stephen said, I agree with him, we've tried this experiment of, one particular model, which involves lowering tariffs and involves a lot of very business friendly rules. I mean, Scott, the Cato folks must be like flipping their lid to have like classic rent-seeking protectionist tools like monopoly, Jesus, I'm having a senior moment. Monopoly intellectual property rules, like having extended patents in trade agreements, or having, you guys don't like ISDS, it's a subsidy on offshoring. But all of that being aside, there was one model of rules we tried. And the outcome was, couched as It's free trade. And in fact, it was he who or she who's at the table writes the rules. And there was a lot of efforts to help. No cross talking to the lady, please. There was a lot of effort to write the rules. And so for businesses. And so let's do a version of it that is more oriented towards workers or some of our security and sustainability and really, in a way, ability to weather the future of more pandemics, more climate chaos.
Yeah.
And we're going to just have to make more stuff here or in this region anyway. Let's think about a different model and what the rules are. This is why I think what USTR Thai has done is smart. She's looking at what are the outcomes we want. And then she's trying to develop rules that meet the outcomes. So this administration has seen businesses take the largest benefits of our past trade model. Why is this administration pushing for strong labor rights with strong enforcement? Because you're going to actually require countries to internalize what have been costs basically taken on the back of working people. Why do we want to have rules that, for instance, would internalize environmental dumping or climate dumping? Because you're trying to create the incentives in the actual trade. And here's the controversial part. What if we were looking in some of these sectors at something more like the multi-fiber arrangement, where we went back and we actually negotiated market access in some of these areas where we actually want to make sure we have redundancy of production in the future, still trade. I'm not talking about autarky. I'm talking about allocating production so that we have globally 8 hubs of making medical devices, of producing certain kinds of chips, of basically intentionally improving resilience. It's just a different model than the hyperglobalization, everything goes where the market sends it. And we decide to have those rules. Now, what's going to happen? You're going to have some tariffs. You're going to have some quotas. And for the US to ever get leverage to talk about these rules, honestly, I think there's going to have to be a discussion about renegotiating some of our tariff lines. The Trump administration, USTR Lighthizer, was very smart in using various US trade tools to impose tariffs that then could be negotiated away on behalf of changing some of the terms of trade. And that practically, if you're going to try and change what the dynamic is in the status quo, those are the kinds of leverages. And then stepping back and what are the goals? Let's make trade do that USTR Thai is doing. I think that is the way forward.
Okay, let me ask Scott to respond, and then I'm going to go to a question from the audience.
So I'm only gonna hit on a couple points. First, I think it's always important to remember that this idea of we living in some sort of Friedman-esque free trade paradise in the 1990s and 2000s is just simply belied by the hundreds of trade remedy orders, the Jones Act, you can go through the list of the remaining protectionism that exists. First. Second, it's great to work at Cato because yes, we are very consistent on trying to weed out the protectionism that exists and weed out the political influence in trade agreements. One of the reasons why unilateral liberalization remains such an attractive thing is because it lacks so much of that sausage making, that politicking. And I think it's nice for Lori to kind of admit that we're really talking about today power politics. Just try to trade one interest group for another interest group in terms of influencing U.S. trade policy. We're going to let another group get at the table and have its priorities. And my point is simply that's what trade agreements provide. It's a vehicle for that type of power politics. Instead of the recording industry dictating certain terms, now we're going to have the steel workers dictate them or wherever. And that's, of course, the inevitable result of having politics driving policy instead of having a more open free market policy, which, by the way, today's headline, Switzerland of all places just unilaterally liberalized all of its industrial tariffs. So it's not like this is an impossible pipe dream. Countries still, even today, do this type of stuff.
You heard it here first. Scott thinks working people, working Americans are a special interest.
Okay.
All right. And I think steelworkers unions would be more of a special interest. Of course, workers being all consumers as well, they're never heard from.
Okay, let me ask a question from the audience here, which I think ties into something Stephen and others have talked about. and I think it's been a theme of both this panel, the last panel, this idea that trade agreements are no longer really necessarily just trade in the sense of market access, tariffs, but about economic integration, harmonization, and this is from Keenan Jarbo, I should have said. And the WTO is the wrong institution, and USTR is the wrong lead agency to debate these issues about economic integration and harmonization. How do we better organize and manage these economic interactions? And Lori, I think you were suggesting something along the lines of a multi-fiber arrangement that could be used for other type of industries, but is there, what's the future of the WTO if there is such a future? Do we need such an international standard setting agency?
Can I comment on that?
Please, Bill.
Two things. It's not saying trade agreements are about something else is not new. I mean, from my point of view, the trade agreements have always been something new. Canada and Mexico were about North America and the border. Panama was about the canal. Colombia was about Venezuela. Bahrain was about the Fifth Fleet. Korea was about China. Most of them are about geopolitics. TPP, well, I mean, Obama never cared about how much rice we were going to sell the Japanese. Obama cared about the U.S. presence in the Pacific and how we wanted to signal our determination to be there in economic terms. That's what was behind it. His same thing with TTIP. What Obama's idea was let's create, the world's largest conglomeration of middle-class consumers and set the rules. And the rules then will be rules that if China wants to access the market, they'll have to adhere to the rules. That tanked more because of European opposition, I think, than American. But these things have always been about something else, and that's nothing new. And that was one point. The second point, to respond to something you said, nobody has made much of a defense so far for multilateralism and institutions, and I feel compelled to do that just because I'm an institutionalist. And we spent 70 years building the system that this administration is in the process of tearing down, although probably in a fit of absent-mindedness rather than doing it deliberately. But, at Bretton Woods and subsequently, countries wanted to avoid the 30s, basically. And what Lori is really recommending, basically, is we go back to the 30s and we go back to a world where, and Stephen is really recommending the same thing, we go back to a world where nation states use their leverage to their advantage at the expense of everybody else. That didn't work so well in the 30s, and I don't think it's going to work so well going forward. We set up a rules-based system to try to prevent that from happening. It worked fairly well, and there's always problems. It worked fairly well for 70 years now? Yeah, about 70 years. It's run into a lot of problems right now, thanks to the last administration, and thanks to this one. I mean, I have a lot of problems with the institution, but I end up sort of saying that's what we got, and we got rules, and this administration's basic refusal to adhere to the rules when we lose basically undermines not only the institution, it undermines our credibility when we undertake negotiations. I mean, if that's the world you want, fine, but I don't think it's going to be a very happy one.
Well, wait, yeah, let me just kind of intervene here because I think, first of all, I think you really have to distinguish between two things in the last 70 years. Before 1994, obviously the U.S. had trade disputes with its partners all the time, right? We had the Nixon shock in 1971. We had the Plaza Accords in 1985. We had repeated uses of 301. We had VRAs. We did all kind of stuff. It was not, there were rules, but the U.S. retained a lot of independence and played hardball with its trading partners, including its allies in Japan and Germany on a fairly regular basis. So I don't think we're talking about a system that's lasted 70 years. I think we're talking about an experiment that basically started around 1994-95 with the dispute settlement process at the WTO. And that experiment, lasted for maybe, from more like 20 years, from 95 to around 2015, 2016. And I think that experiment failed. I mean, I think that the big winners of that system were the Chinese Communist Party and not the American worker and not the American consumer, however Scott would define him. I mean, the type of economic performance we saw between 2000 and 2016 was dreadful compared to almost every other period in American history. So I think that was a mistake. And as for the rest of the WTO, people can still use every other function of the WTO still exists and it's still there and it's still useful and will continue to be there and will continue to be useful. The only thing that isn't there now is the ability of the appellate body to impose policies on the US and other countries. And that was not something we agreed to in 1993, 1994. That's not something we thought the appellate body was going to do. We just had a misunderstanding. The Europeans understood much better than we did what the AB was going to do. And that didn't work out. And I do not think you're going to see this administration or any other administration build up the AB again so that they can strike down the Inflation Reduction Act and strike down the, all the other things this administration is trying to do.
Can I just make a quick point? The idea that the appellate body was imposing decisions on the United States, given the fact that the United States, as Steve well knows with respect to zeroing, disregarded those decisions when it politically necessary to do so.
Did they disregard did they disregard the decisions on zeroing? Because they did not disregard the decisions on zero.
It took decades of disputes.
I don't think it took decades.
Business, but
I think it took a few years, and then they complied.
Not imposed on the United States.
What about the Byrd Amendment, Scott? Did they comply with the Byrd Amendment?
Yeah, certainly the United States complied.
Let me ask Lori, what do you think about this? I want to ask your opinion here because I know you wanted to jump in.
Well, first, Bill, I'm not going for autarky. Actually, if I had to go back for a multilateral system, like Beth Baltzan mentioned, the ITO, which had the GATT, and then had various other international rules associated with it, like the International Labor Organization standards, at the point where the IMF was dealing with currency manipulation, et cetera. So I would rather go to something like the GATT plus the stuff that was in the ITO that would deal with trade. Now, again, we were talking hypotheticals. I understand we're not really getting rid of GATTs, AGP, TRIPS, TRIMS, et cetera. But if you had a magic wand, I would go to something like the ITO, where you basically take the trade rules, you have them multilaterally, and you put in what I would call sort of the floor of decency. You have the other international standards that countries have agreed to as sovereigns. And I would add the thing that was missing at that point, which is the whole body of multilateral environmental agreements. The ILO was already conceptualized, et cetera. And so I would have my sort of commercial rules there, but connected to the human conditions that you would want to have the commercial rules conditioned on, like you have in US law. Then separately, the question that the questioner asked, Keenan, which is the WTO the place? And the answer is no. And in fact, the trade realm isn't the place. You wouldn't have had me and all of the environmental folks and the food safety folks and the AIDS activists and everyone else who has been very upset with the string of rulings because, Scott, give me a break. The facts, Article 20 of GATT doesn't work as an exception. There have been 48 attempted uses of it since the WTO was hatched. In 46 of those cases, it was sacked. So yes, we didn't just change the Byrd rule and zeroing. We also rolled back Clean Air Act regs, country of origin meat labels, various Endangered Species Act regs with respect to sea turtles. I mean, we basically have not had a system where actually the trade rules don't undermine those other things. But one thing I would suggest for folks to look at as part of the problem is we have the trade regime writing rules on all these other issues that has actually created enormous baggage for the trade regime. Go to our website at rethinktrade.org and look at the loaded feature. We did a takedown of coding all of the US official trade advisors, and you can see the disproportionate commercial interest. Now, if it's really about trade and actual commercial activity, makes sense. But why would that crew be writing the rules on food safety? Or for that matter, deciding, online privacy rules, where there are a lot of other stakeholders who have very legitimate reasons besides the businesses to have a say, which gets to the situation we keep getting ourselves in, which is the stuff that really shouldn't be in a trade agreement. The newest one is digital trade. So you've got the big tech guys trying to take a page out of Big Pharma's rules. Big Pharma puts in free trade agreements, monopoly patent extensions. Like, very clever because it gets an extension of our patent from 17 years to 20 years through the WTO. However, all of these now big tech guys trying to rig up the rules of the WTO, of the IPEF, with rules that would undermine bipartisan rules on digital antitrust, on privacy, on AI oversight. That's going to be another of those things that smacks the trade agenda. the TPP, one of the big reasons it went down, it expanded ISDS and it expanded patent really monopolies. That was as big of an issue as the trade issues. And so, no, the trade agenda, just to sum, is not the place, questioner, to be putting all of these other rules, but you can fix the trade rules, including multilaterally. You need to actually make those work for working people as well, and for the environment.
Thank you, Lori. I'm going to steal one of your phrases, waving a magic wand. If you could wave a magic wand, and let me ask maybe Scott, like if you could wave a magic wand, what kind of a trading system would you have?
Well, I mean, unilateral liberalization would be the obvious starting point, right? We have reams of economic literature showing that the country is better off when we lower our trading barriers to allow for more economic growth and for better living standards and for a more competitive domestic industry. Now, look, I'll just say, though, I agree with Bill that I think the WTO system has been, as far as it goes, pretty effective, too. So if I were to wave more of a realistic magic wand, it would be to bring the WTO back to the center of this and get back to a multilateral system of real dispute settlement and comprehensive negotiations. But look, that's almost as fanciful as the first one.
All right, Bill, how about you? You've now got the magic wand. What do you think?
I would look for, I actually would, I don't agree with Scott on a lot of things, but institutionally, I think he's on the right track. I think the system would benefit the most if we had an institution that had a strong dispute settlement mechanism and a much more effective negotiating capability. I mean, one of the things that has happened in part because of the dispute resolution has been I think the negotiating capability of the organization has gotten much weaker as well. I mean, there's reasons for that. Going back to what Lori was talking about earlier, the agenda has gotten a lot more complicated and agreement is a lot more difficult. I'd look for a system in which we were find a way to try to restore the viability of that, and find a way, a system that has a dispute settlement mechanism that actually resolves problems, that produces some final decision, and countries that recognize that some days you eat the bear and some days the bear eats you, and if you lose, you lose, and you comply and move on. We've kind of lost that. What we're heading toward, I think, more realistically, is not that, but plurilateralism, coalitions of the willing, where countries that want to do more on whatever it is get together and agree to do that. And the WTO is at least implicitly recognized that, except for the Indians and the South Africans who are standing in the way for the most part. But I think most countries want to go down that road and say, look, we would like to go farther. Let's find other countries that also want to go farther, and let's get together and see if we can agree. I think that would be a productive way forward. At the end of the day, you get lots of agreements that are partial, and hopefully ones that are open rather than closed, although that creates free rider problems. And then the WTO stitches them together. But that's a generation-long task.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And so, Stephen, you're the last. You've got about a minute left. You're the only one who hasn't had the magic wand, so I pass it to you.
Well, I mean, I thanks for everybody, and I think it's been a very helpful discussion. I just would say, yeah, I mean, for me, I generally agree with Lori. I think we have a great policymaking process here in the United States. It's worked for us for a really, really long time. It's how we write our tax laws. It's how we write our environmental laws. It's how we write our labor laws. And I would really like to basically see more of this policymaking come back to the United States, come back to the Congress, let them kind of balance all the different issues. I mean, Scott's absolutely right. Some people benefit from one regime, some people benefit more from a different regime. The Congress should work that out, and we should work that out internally. And then I think we use the leverage that we have to get the best deals we can with the rest of the world. And I do agree with Bill. I think we're headed toward more of a plurilateral system. So I'm relatively optimistic in terms of the way things are going.
Outstanding. Well, an excellent way to end the panel. Thank you so much, all, for taking the time today, and for WITA for hosting us, and for all of you online that watch this great discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian. This was a tough one to navigate all the different pieces and the different perspectives. And I know there's a lot of passion on various sides on this, and that's why we wanted to bring this group together. We really appreciate all of you very much. Thanks to those of you who've been watching. The video will be available if you've missed anything or want to see more of this discussion or to hear it again. Shout out to my friend Ken Jarbo, who I know is an old friend of Bill Reinsch's as well, from our days together on the Hill back in the 80s for him and in the 90s for myself. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thanks for this great discussion. Scott, Bill, Lori, Stephen, and Brian, really grateful to you, and as well our first panel, who I know many of whom they stayed on and have been watching in the background. So thank you all very much. Everyone take care. Have a great holiday season, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you either in person or online at WITA again in 2024. Thanks, everybody.
Many thanks.